Jake had always been known for his unusual ideas. While most of his neighbors in the quiet ranching town were content with their barns, cattle, and simple routines, Jake had a streak of creativity that often surprised people. His ranch, spread over several acres, wasn't just a working property, it was also his playground for experiments. Some years he tried raising exotic chickens, other years he toyed with building that looked like miniature castles. But none of his earlier projects came close to what he did one warm spring afternoon. Jake had purchased a houseboat. It wasn't the kind of weathered boat one might picture rusting away at a forgotten dock. This one was a well-kept, freshly painted, two-story beauty with a sun deck on top and windows that gleamed in the afternoon light. The kind of floating home that looked like it belonged on a postcard from a lakeside vacation town. Most people would have parked it at a marina or left it in storage until summer travel plans. Jake, however, had other ideas. On his property was a modest but lovely lake. It stretched wide, catching the sky like glass, and was surrounded by soft, rolling grass. The lake had been his favorite spot since childhood, a place where he'd fished with his grandfather and spent countless evenings skipping stones across the calm surface. Jake always thought it was the crown jewel of his land, and now he had found a way to enjoy it in a way nobody else in town would have imagined. He arranged for the houseboat to be delivered by a hauling crew. Neighbors from down the road slowed their trucks as they passed, craning their necks at the enormous sight. It wasn't every day that someone saw a floating home moving through dusty country roads. When the crew finally slid the boat into the water and it settled with a graceful bob, Jake grinned like a boy on Christmas morning. The houseboat looked perfect on the lake. Its white trim contrasted beautifully with the deep blue water, and the gentle ripples lapped against its sides as though welcoming a new guest. Jake walked aboard, testing the deck, and felt the structure sway slightly beneath him. He loved it immediately. Inside, the boat was cozy. There was a small living room with nautical, a compact kitchen, and a loft bedroom above. It wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. For Jake, it was freedom. A private getaway without ever leaving his land. He could sip his coffee in the morning while watching the sun rise over the fields, or sit on the deck in the evening with a book as the water mirrored the stars. Jake invited a few close friends to see it that evening. They arrived with wide eyes and cheerful laughter, stepping aboard with cautious excitement. Everyone agreed it was one of the most unusual and charming things they'd ever seen on a ranch. One friend joked that Jake had just created the first floating cabin in the county. But while Jake and his friends enjoyed the novelty, others were less impressed. From across the water, the nearby neighborhood could see the boat clearly. A row of homes with neatly trimmed lawns stood along the far side of the lake, and their residents soon gathered to stare. To them, the houseboat wasn't just surprising, it was puzzling. They were used to uniform views and familiar scenery, and suddenly there was a gleaming, floating structure right where they often took evening walks. The next morning, Jake noticed a few of them standing near the shore, pointing and whispering. He waved politely, but their hesitant nods told him they weren't as enthusiastic as his friends had been. Jake chuckled to himself, assuming they were simply curious. After all, who wouldn't be? A floating home on a quiet ranch lake was bound to catch attention. As he brewed his morning coffee and stepped onto the deck, Jake had no idea that his latest idea was about to spark more drama than he had ever intended. For him, the houseboat was just a retreat, a harmless and joyful addition to his land. But for those who watched from across the lake, it was the beginning of a story that would ripple far beyond the water's edge. Jake leaned against the railing, taking in the morning air. The water shimmered, and a soft breeze moved across the surface. In that moment, all he felt was peace. Little did he know, before long, strangers would arrive at his door, questions would be asked, and an unexpected twist would change everything about the lake he thought he knew so well. The following morning, Jake stepped out onto the deck of his new houseboat with a steaming mug of coffee in hand. The air was cool, the sky washed in pastel hues of sunrise, and the water below rocked gently, creating the kind of morning that made him grateful for his little experiment. He inhaled deeply, savoring the fresh air, before lowering himself into a chair to enjoy the calm. It didn't last long. By mid-morning, a convoy of 3 SUVs rolled down the gravel road that wound around his property. Their doors opened in near-perfect unison, and out stepped three people who moved with a sense of purpose. At the center was a woman in her late 50s with neatly styled silver hair, wearing a tailored jacket despite the casual day. She carried herself with authority, the kind that came from years of being listened to. On either side of her were two board members who looked equally serious, though slightly less confident. Jake watched from the deck, sipping his coffee as they approached the shore. He had a hunch about who they were. "Mister," the woman called out, her voice carrying across the water. Jake rose and waved. "Morning, lovely day, isn't it?" She didn't smile. "I'm president of the homeowners board for the neighborhood on the far side of this lake. We need to have a word with you about that structure." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Structure, you mean my houseboat?" Her eyes narrowed. "Yes, that." Deciding to be polite, Jake walked down the gangway to meet them on the shore. The two men crossed their arms, clearly there to back her up. He greeted them with a friendly nod, though their expressions remained stern. "I'm afraid this isn't going to work," began. "You can't just put something like that here. It violates the appearance standards and regulations set for the area." Jake blinked. "Violates? I'm not sure what you mean. This lake is on my ranch. It's private property." "That may be," said briskly, "but our residents have a right to a consistent environment. That floating cabin doesn't match. You'll need to remove it." Jake held back a smile. He had expected curiosity, maybe even a few questions, but this sounded more like a demand than a conversation. He folded his arms casually, keeping his voice calm. "With all respect, ma'am, I don't answer to your neighborhood's rules. My family has owned this land, including the lake, for decades. The houseboat is here legally, and I plan to enjoy it." The two board members exchanged quick glances but pressed on. "That's not how this works, mister. There are guidelines. Our community was built around this lake. If you do whatever you want, it affects all of us. We can issue fines, and we can take legal action if necessary." Jake tilted his head. "Fines, legal action on my land?" He chuckled softly, more amused than offended. "I don't think so. This lake isn't shared. It's fully within my property lines. You're welcome to look at the county survey if you'd like." Lips tightened. She clearly wasn't used to being challenged. The board members shuffled uncomfortably, as though unsure how far to push. Jake decided to ease the tension. "Look, I get it. This is unusual, but it's harmless. I'm not running a business out here. I just wanted a quiet spot to relax. That boat doesn't affect your homes any more than a row of ducks would." The metaphor didn't win her over. "Unusual or not, it doesn't belong. You'll hear from us again soon." With that, she spun on her heel and strode back toward the SUVs, her companions hurrying behind her. Jake stood by the water, watching as the vehicles rumbled away, raising small clouds of dust. He took another sip of coffee, shaking his head with a grin. "They're going to make this interesting," he muttered. By evening, Jake noticed more neighbors gathering across the lake. Some peered through binoculars, others just stood talking in clusters. Word had spread quickly, and while many seemed simply curious, a few wore the same disapproving frowns as. Jake, however, wasn't rattled. He knew the boundaries of his property better than anyone, and he had every document to back him up. The lake was his, the boat was his, and no amount of frowning from across the water was going to change that. Still, as he sat on the deck that night with the soft hum of crickets in the background, Jake had the distinct feeling that this was only the beginning. Something told him the neighbors weren't going to give up so easily. And he was right. 2 days passed before the next chapter in the unfolding drama began. Jake had enjoyed a peaceful stretch of mornings on his deck, watching the mist rise from the lake, and evenings spent grilling on the little patio at the stern of the boat. He had almost convinced himself that the stern words from were nothing more than empty talk. Perhaps, he thought, she had simply needed to vent her disapproval and would move on once she realized the boat wasn't harming anyone. But on the third morning, Jake was jolted from his quiet breakfast by the sound of sirens in the distance. They grew louder until a pair of patrol cars came into view, their lights flashing as they turned down his gravel drive. Jake set down his coffee and leaned on the railing of the boat, curious rather than worried. The cars pulled to a stop near the water's edge, and 2 uniformed officers stepped out. Behind them, another vehicle arrived, this time a dark sedan that looked far too polished for ranch roads. Out stepped, her expression one of stern determination. Jake climbed off the boat and walked toward the officers with an easy stride. "Morning, what brings you out here?" One of the officers, a tall man with a calm voice, gave him a polite nod. "Morning, sir. We had a call from the neighborhood across the way, something about an unauthorized structure on the lake." Jake chuckled. "Ah, I see. Well, you found the right place. That's my houseboat, and as it happens, this is my lake." Stepped forward before the officer could respond. "Officers, he's disturbing the area. That boat doesn't belong here. It's against the rules we've established, and we demand it be removed." The officer glanced at her, then back at Jake. "Sir, do you have proof of ownership for this property?" "Of course," Jake said, pulling a rolled-up survey map from a weatherproof case near the dock. He had anticipated this moment. "This map shows the boundaries of my land. The lake sits entirely within my property lines." The officer unrolled the document on the hood of his car, studying the details with care. His partner leaned in, tracing the boundary lines with a finger. Both nodded in unison. "Everything checks out," the taller officer said at last. He handed the map back to Jake. "This lake is private property and the boat is within your rights. We don't see any law being broken here." His face turned a shade deeper, her lips pressed tight. "You can't be serious. It's clearly disruptive to the neighborhood. Look at it. It ruins the view, and it doesn't comply with the environment we've worked so hard to maintain." The second officer offered her a sympathetic but firm tone. "Ma'am, with respect, your guidelines don't extend onto his property. Unless there's a public safety issue, there's nothing for us to enforce." Jake folded his arms, keeping his tone light. "I told you, it's not against any rules, just a man enjoying his own lake." For a moment, silence hung heavy. Neighbors from across the water had begun to gather along the far shore, watching the scene unfold like it was the highlight of their week. Some even whispered to one another, hands shielding their mouths. The spectacle had drawn an audience, and Jake suspected hated that more than anything. She tried once more. "This isn't finished. You may think you've won, but our association has influence, you'll see." The officers gave Jake a final nod before climbing back into their cars. Engines rumbled, lights flicked off, and soon the patrol cars were gone, leaving only the dark sedan still parked by the shore. Lingered for a moment longer, her eyes fixed on Jake as though daring him to take her seriously. Then, with a sharp motion, she turned and drove off. Jake exhaled slowly, amused more than annoyed. He had expected pushback, but calling the police had been a bold move. It confirmed what he already sensed, wasn't going to let this go quietly. That night, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange and pink, Jake sat on his deck, listening to the soft lap of water against the hull. He thought about the look on the officers' faces when they confirmed his ownership. More importantly, he thought about the papers in his safe, the ones that not only proved the lake was his but hinted at something even bigger. Because hidden in the fine print of that survey was a detail that no one in the neighborhood seemed to remember. A detail that would soon change the balance of power on the lake forever. The morning after the police visit, Jake awoke to a still lake and a sky streaked with gold. From his deck, everything looked peaceful, but he knew better. The visit from and the officers had only been the first round. She wasn't the type to walk away quietly. Jake had seen the determination in her eyes. Something told him that sooner or later she would be back. As he sipped his coffee, Jake thought about the folder in his safe. He had studied it more than once, but until now, it had always been more of a curiosity than anything else. The folder contained the land surveys and title papers his grandfather had kept carefully preserved, some dating back nearly half a century. It was in those papers that Jake had discovered an unusual detail, a small oversight that had gone unnoticed when the neighborhood across the lake had been developed years ago. Jake finished his coffee, went inside the boat, and retrieved the folder. He spread the papers across his small dining table, the edges yellowed with age but still clear. The maps showed the outline of his ranch, the lake, and something more. The marina on the far side, the very one that residents used daily, was marked entirely within his property. He remembered the first time he noticed it. He had laughed, thinking it was a surveying mistake, But further research confirmed it. The land beneath the marina, the dock, and even the boat slips technically sat on ranch property. His family had never said anything about it, and for decades the neighborhood had simply used it freely. Jake hadn't cared either, until now. By late morning, his instincts proved correct. A knock on the door of the houseboat broke his concentration. When he opened it, he wasn't surprised to see standing there, this time without her board members but no less stern. "We need to talk," she said. Jake gestured her inside. "Of course, can I offer you coffee?" She shook her head. "Mister, I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation. Your boat is not just unusual, it's disruptive. Our residents are upset. They feel their lakefront views and property values are being diminished. If you won't remove it voluntarily, our board will find another way." Jake leaned against the counter, studying her carefully. "I understand that some people might not like the change, but I've been patient and I've explained this is my property. You've even involved the police and they confirmed it, yet you're still here." Raised her chin. "Because this is bigger than just paperwork. We're responsible for protecting the character of the neighborhood. If that means escalating further, we will." Jake opened the folder and slid one of the maps toward her across the counter. "Then, perhaps you should take a closer look at this before you decide how far to escalate." She frowned but picked up the paper. Her eyes scanned the lines, the labels, the notes in the surveyor's hand. At first her expression was unmoved, but then her brow furrowed. She read it again. "This can't be right," she murmured. "Oh, it's right," Jake said calmly. "That marina your board takes so much pride in, the one you've been managing, repairing, and charging residents for actually sits on my land, which means it isn't yours to control." His face drained of color. She lowered the map, clutching it tightly. "That's impossible. The marina was part of the neighborhood plan from the beginning." Jake shrugged. "And yet the documents say otherwise. My grandfather noticed it years ago but never made a fuss. I didn't either until you tried to tell me I couldn't enjoy my own lake. Now, however, I think it's time I clarified ownership." For a long moment said nothing. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the map and placed it back on the table. Finally, she found her voice, though it was quieter than before. "Do you realize what this means?" Jake smiled faintly. "I realize it means your board doesn't hold as much sway over me as you thought. In fact, it might mean quite the opposite." Back toward the door, her composure shaken. "We'll review this. I'll need to verify." "Of course," Jake said smoothly. "Take all the time you need. But remember, the next time you think about challenging me, you might be arguing over a marina that technically belongs to me." She left without another word, her heels clicking sharply against the dock as she hurried away. Jake closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. He had played his hand. The truth was out now, and there was no putting it back. The residents across the lake would soon learn that their prized marina wasn't theirs at all. For Jake, the houseboat had started as a simple idea for peace and quiet. But now, the situation had grown into something much larger. He wasn't just defending his right to float a boat on his own lake. He was holding the key to the very heart of the neighborhood's identity. And whether they liked it or not, the balance of power had just shifted in his favor. Jake didn't expect to hear from so soon, but the very next afternoon a group of residents gathered near the marina. From his deck, he could see them forming a semicircle as stood at the center, papers in hand, her voice raised so that even the breeze carried her words across the water. She was explaining, insisting, and trying her best to calm the unease that was spreading among the homeowners. Jake watched quietly. He didn't need to be close to understand what was happening. She had seen the same documents he had, and now she was scrambling to control the narrative before it slipped completely from her grasp. Later that evening, Jake drove into town for supplies. To his surprise, 2 residents approached him in the grocery store parking lot. They weren't confrontational. In fact, they looked nervous, as though speaking to him might get back to the board. "Mister," one of them asked, adjusting his cap. "We heard something about that marina, about it actually sitting on your land. Is that true?" Jake gave a slow nod. "That's what the papers say. My family has owned this lake and the land beneath it for a long time. The marina was built without anyone realizing the boundary line." The second resident sighed. I figured as much. Never admitted it, but she couldn't explain away what folks have seen in the maps. People are starting to wonder if we've been paying fees all these years for something that didn't even belong to the association. Jake didn't press the point, but their words stayed with him. It was clear the news had already begun to spread through the neighborhood, and the more it spread, the more cracks appeared in carefully built authority. The next morning, Jake decided to make things official. He walked over to the marina with a small group of friends who had come to visit, bringing along a neatly typed notice he had prepared the night before. Residents watched from porches and windows as Jake pinned the notice on the message board near the dock. The sign was simple but clear. Welcome to Marina, managed by the ranch. Neighbors and friends welcome. The words sent a ripple through the crowd. Some were startled, others amused, and a few even clapped quietly as Jake stepped back. It wasn't a declaration of war, it was an invitation. Appeared soon after, her stride brisk, her expression tight. She stopped in front of the sign, reading it twice as though hoping the words might change. Then she turned to Jake. You can't do this, she said, her voice low but edged with frustration. Jake kept his tone calm. I already did. The land and the dock belong to my family. The documents prove it. I've simply chosen to manage it myself now. But notice the last line, neighbors and friends are welcome. I'm not shutting anyone out. I'm opening it up. The gathered residents began to murmur, their expressions shifting from concern to relief. For years, they had paid fees for access to the marina, watching their money go into maintenance costs and board projects. Now, Jake was offering it without restriction. One man stepped forward. Does this mean we don't have to pay those association fees for the marina anymore? Jake smiled faintly. It means I'm not charging you for using something that sits on my land. What you do about your fees is between you and your board. The crowd chuckled and a wave of approval spread among them. For once, Jake wasn't just defending himself. He was giving them something the board never had, choice. His face tightened, but she couldn't argue without admitting the truth in front of everyone. She retreated quickly, her authority visibly shaken. That evening, Jake sat on the deck of his houseboat, watching as families strolled to the marina, children laughing as they ran down the dock. There was a lightness in the air, a shift in energy. Neighbors who had once looked at his boat with suspicion now waved at him across the water, grateful for his openness. Jake leaned back in his chair, feeling the change settle in. The battle wasn't over. He knew would find another angle, but for the first time, the tide had turned. He wasn't just defending his right to enjoy his property anymore. He was setting the tone for how the lake would be enjoyed by everyone. What had started as a houseboat experiment had grown into something much larger. The residents had begun to see that Jake's presence on the lake wasn't a disruption at all. It was an opportunity. And for that realization was more threatening than anything else. The following week was anything but quiet for the neighborhood across the lake. What had once been a united front of orderly routines and polished lawns now hummed with restless conversations. Neighbors gathered in driveways, whispering about the marina, the fees they'd paid for years, and the bold new sign that declared the dock belonged to ranch. Called an emergency board meeting that Wednesday evening. The clubhouse, usually a place for casual gatherings and card games, was filled with tense energy. Board members sat in a half-circle around a long table, papers spread out, while stood at the head, her posture stiff and her expression severe. This situation, she began, her voice sharp, is a threat to everything we've built here. If residents start believing that Marina belongs to Jake, our influence is gone. We need to find a way to counter his claim. One board member, a middle-aged man named Robert, raised his hand. With respect, people have already seen the documents. The surveys don't lie. If the marina really does sit on his land, what can we possibly argue? Glared at him. We can argue that surveys are open to interpretation. That lines shift, records change. We'll hire our own attorney and commission another survey if we have to. This cannot stand. But her words didn't seem to lift the room. Instead, a heavy silence followed. Another member, a woman named Helen, finally spoke. What if he's right? What if we've been charging for something that wasn't ours to manage? People are already asking for refunds. If we fight this, we risk more than embarrassment. We risk losing their trust. His jaw tightened. If we admit he's right, we lose control completely. We can't allow that. The debate dragged on for over an hour, voices rising and falling as members argued over strategy. Some insisted on doubling down, others quietly leaned toward accepting Jake's ownership and moving on. But no matter which side they landed on, everyone could see the same truth. The balance of power had shifted. While the board bickered, Jake remained calm. From his houseboat, he watched the marina come alive in ways it hadn't in years. Families visited more often, children played along the docks, and neighbors stopped by to fish or launch kayaks. The atmosphere was lighter, freer, as if a weight had been lifted. Without fees or restrictions, the marina felt like a gathering place again, and Jake made sure to greet everyone with a friendly smile. One evening, as he grilled burgers on the deck, a group of residents paddled over in a canoe. They tied off at his boat and climbed aboard, bringing a plate of homemade cookies as thanks. "We just wanted to say we appreciate what you're doing," one of them said. "It feels like the lake belongs to all of us again, not just rules and payments. People are happy, Jake." Their words warmed him. He hadn't set out to change the neighborhood's spirit, but somehow that's exactly what was happening. Meanwhile, the tension across the water deepened. Rumors spread of heated exchanges at board meetings. Some residents even began to skip the meetings altogether, claiming they'd rather spend their evenings at the marina with their families. Every empty chair at the clubhouse was another quiet sign that the board's grip was loosening. By the weekend, the cracks became impossible to ignore. At a neighborhood barbecue, voices rose louder than the music when a group of residents openly questioned. "Why are we still paying for the marina if it isn't ours?" one man asked. "What about all the fees collected over the years?" another demanded. Tried to calm the crowd with promises of looking into it, but the usual authority in her tone no longer carried weight. People were no longer satisfied with vague reassurances. They wanted answers, and for the first time, they weren't afraid to push back. From his boat, Jake could see the gathering on the far shore. Though he couldn't hear every word, the frustration was clear in the body language. The folded arms, the pointed fingers, the clusters of residents turning away from and toward one another. Jake leaned against the railing, thoughtful. He hadn't planned any of this, but now it was unfolding on its own. His boat had started as a personal retreat, yet somehow it had sparked a shift that reached beyond his property. The residents were waking up to the idea that their lives didn't have to be managed so tightly. As the sun set, casting a golden shimmer across the water, Jake realized something important. He wasn't just holding proof of ownership anymore. He was holding an opportunity to reshape how the people around the lake lived and enjoyed their space. And whether admitted it or not, the tide of change was already moving against her. The morning air over the lake was crisp, and the water reflected the sky in shimmering silver streaks. Jake stood on the dock with a folder tucked under his arm, a mix of determination and quiet satisfaction in his step. For days, he had considered what to do next. The marina was legally his, that much was settled, but now he needed to decide how it would function, not just for himself, but for the growing number of neighbors who saw it as a place of freedom. He invited the residents to a casual gathering at the dock that Saturday. Word spread quickly, and by mid-morning, families arrived carrying lawn chairs, coolers, and folding tables covered with food. The marina had become something of a festival ground, the smell of barbecue mingling with the sound of laughter and splashing water. Jake stepped onto the small wooden platform at the edge of the dock and raised his hand for attention. Conversations quieted, and eyes turned toward him. "Thanks for coming out," he began, his voice steady. "I know a lot has happened these past few weeks. When I brought my boat here, I didn't plan on shaking things up, but it looks like the lake had other plans for us." A few chuckles rolled through the crowd, easing the tension. "The truth is simple," Jake continued. "The marina sits on my land and the paperwork proves it, but I don't want this to just be about ownership. I want this to be a place people can enjoy without feeling like they're walking into a gatekeeper's office. So here's my idea. From now on, the marina will be open to all residents of this neighborhood and beyond, free of charge. No fees, no fines, just a space for us to share." The words landed like a spark in dry grass. Applause broke out almost instantly, followed by cheers and shouts of support. Children clapped their hands, parents nodded approvingly, and even a few long-time residents who had once defended the old board rules raised their voices in approval. One man stepped forward, his voice carrying across the crowd. "That's what we've been waiting for, Jake. A place that feels like it belongs to us again. You're doing what should have been done a long time ago." Jake gave a humble nod. "Then let's make it happen together. If we're going to keep the marina clean, safe, and enjoyable, it'll take all of us pitching in. I'll handle the upkeep on my end, but I'd love volunteers for small projects, painting, fixing benches, planting flowers. If we do it as a community, this place will shine." Dozens of hands shot up immediately. People called out offers. "I can bring tools. I'll repaint the dock. My kids can plant flowers," and the energy grew electric. The marina wasn't just a dock anymore. It was a symbol of what they could accomplish when no one was hovering over them with fines or threats. Meanwhile, across the water, and a few board members stood at the edge of the clubhouse lawn, watching the crowd with tight expressions. Their attempts to quiet the unrest had failed, and now, in plain view, their authority was slipping away. The cheers for Jake carried clearly across the lake, each one a reminder that the neighborhood no longer looked to them for guidance. Inside the clubhouse later that afternoon slammed her binder shut. "This is chaos," she muttered. "He's turning our residents against us." But Robert, the more practical board member, leaned back in his chair. "Or maybe they're just realizing they don't need us as much as we thought. Maybe it's time we let it go." Sclaire could have frozen water, but even she couldn't ignore the truth. The crowd by the marina outnumbered the handful of loyalists still standing behind her. That evening, as lanterns glowed along the dock and music drifted over the water, Jake felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He hadn't just proven a legal point, he had created something lasting. The residents weren't just visitors now, they were partners in shaping the marina's future. Families lingered long into the night, children running along the planks while parents swapped stories under the soft glow of string lights Jake had hung earlier that day. The sound of laughter echoed across the lake, reaching the empty clubhouse where the board sat in silence. Jake leaned against the railing of his houseboat, watching it all unfold. The marina was no longer a place of rules and restrictions. It had become a gathering ground, a hub of energy, and a symbol of freedom. For the first time in years, the lake felt alive, and Jake knew this was only the beginning. The lake was unusually calm that Sunday morning, as though it, too, sensed a turning point had arrived. The marina, now freshly painted and thanks to volunteers, looked brighter than ever. Benches had been sanded and polished, flower pots lined the walkway, and colorful kayaks were tied neatly along the dock. What had once been a symbol of control and conflict had transformed into a place of warmth and connection. Jake stood at the end of the dock, sipping his coffee as the sun climbed higher, watching the reflections ripple across the water. He could hear faint voices drifting from the clubhouse. Today, the board had called another meeting, one they insisted was critical. But Jake suspected it was less about strategy and more about surrender. By mid-afternoon, word spread across the neighborhood. The board wanted to make an announcement. Residents who might once have attended out of obligation now gathered out of curiosity. The crowd filled the clubhouse lawn, a mix of folded arms, skeptical faces, and eager chatter. Appeared on the steps, her usual air of confidence dimmed but not gone. She adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "Neighbors," she began, "we've heard your concerns. After careful review and discussion with our advisors, the board acknowledges that the marina is not under our jurisdiction. It is, in fact, part of the ranch property." Murmurs spread through the crowd, though no one looked surprised. Pressed on. "As such, all past fees collected in connection with the marina will be reviewed, and where possible, refunds will be issued. Going forward, access and management of the marina will rest entirely with Mr." A ripple of applause began, hesitant at first, then swelling into a chorus. Residents clapped, whistled, and cheered, their relief audible in every sound. Tried to continue, but her voice was drowned out by the celebration. For years, she had stood as the unshakable authority, but now her words barely carried weight. Jake, standing near the back of the crowd, raised his hand in a casual wave. He wasn't looking for glory, but the residents turned toward him anyway, their cheers growing louder. Someone shouted, "3 cheers for Jake!" and the crowd responded with laughter and applause. His expression tightened, but there was nothing more she could do. The board's influence had evaporated, carried away by the tide of change that had begun with a single houseboat on the lake. Later that evening, the marina glowed once again with lanterns and string lights. Families gathered for what felt less like a party and more like the beginning of a new tradition. Children chased each other along the docks, couples shared quiet moments by the water, and neighbors who had once barely spoken now traded stories over picnic tables. Jake stood near his houseboat, shaking hands and accepting thanks, though he reminded everyone the real victory wasn't his alone. "This marina belongs to all of us now," he said warmly. "It only works because we make it work together." As the night wore on, he stepped back onto his boat and leaned against the railing, watching the scene unfold. The air buzzed with laughter, the soft strum of a guitar, and the distant splash of someone diving into the water. The lake, once quiet and restrained, now pulsed with life. He thought back to that first day, when he had simply wanted a peaceful retreat. He never imagined that anchoring his houseboat would trigger such a ripple effect. What began as a standoff with the board had turned into something bigger, a shift in how people saw themselves, their neighbors, and their shared spaces. Across the water, the clubhouse sat dark and quiet, its once bustling meetings replaced by gatherings on the dock. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. One side represented rules, paperwork, and control. The other, laughter, light, and freedom. Jake smiled to himself. The outcome wasn't just about winning ownership of a marina. It was about proving that people didn't need constant oversight to enjoy their lives. They could choose connection over control, trust over tension. As the stars began to appear overhead, the houseboat rocked gently against its moorings. Jake exhaled, content. The marina was secure, the residents were happy, and the board had finally stepped aside. The lake had found its new chapter, and so had he. For Jake, it wasn't about being the owner of the marina anymore. It was about being the steward of something much more important. A place where people felt free to live, laugh, and belong. And as the night deepened, with lanterns flickering against the dark water, Jake knew this was only the beginning of a story that would continue to grow with every sunrise on the lake. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.